Hello and welcome to the Fighting Spirit Podcast. As always, I'm Jason, and I'm here to talk about UFC 238, where Henry Cejudo became the new Triple C champ at Bantam, champ at Flyweight, and Olympic gold medal champion. As for me, my picks were okay. We finished 7-6 on the night, but let's get into it. Here's the show. So let's talk about our main event. That was an amazing contest. Henry Cejudo deserves everything he's earned. And Moraes, I feel a little bad for the guy, but hey, he did his best. Let's talk about it though. So in this first round, I really thought that our pick, Moraes here, we got this one wrong, was going to end up taking this away. He was staying at range. He was hitting Cejudo with a lot of great leg kicks. He was hitting him to the body. He was throwing great kicks and keeping him at that distance, and I really thought that was Cejudo we were going to see. He was going to be, hard pressed to engage. He was going to feel like he couldn't get inside, and he was going to be outstruck all night and basically just lunging for, rangy takedowns and weren't ultimately going to work, which is pretty much how we saw it playing out. We didn't see too many takedowns from Cejudo, just the one on the night. But that second round comes around, and then we see Cejudo, in his corner. They said, hey, you're treating this like the Mighty Mouse fight. Get in there, bully this man. Take him down, put the pressure on him, do whatever you gotta do. Get in his face. Take the range away from Moraes. And once he did that, it was like a firework went off, because then Moraes was being pressured. He was being hit with bombs. He was being hit with tight uppercuts. Cejudo was making it into a dogfight, just like he did against Mighty Mouse. And he obviously ended up stopping him in the third round. You could see that he ended up kind of breaking Moraes. Moraes was a guy, he started going backwards, where he's a guy that generally only goes forwards. And he just, cracked under the pressure, under the constant barrage of assaultive punches that Cejudo threw at him. And nothing against Moraes. He looked decent definitely in the first round. And, as kind of the storm came into the second, it just broke him. We got this one wrong, and it is what it is. I gotta say, I really am happy to see Cejudo win, and, we just got to accept the fact that we were not able to pick the main event this evening. It's just how it plays out, but congratulations to Henry Cejudo. I am happy to see you fight again, and hey, hopefully maybe you become the first quad champ if that's possible. I don't know if that's going to play out too well for you. We'll talk about that if it comes to fruition, but hats off to Henry Cejudo. Great night, Triple C. I look forward to seeing you fight again, and congratulations for a spectacular performance. Moving on to our co-main. This is a fight we predicted right, but basically the entire world did. We had Valentina Shevchenko taking on Jessica Eye for the ladies flyweight title. And Shevchenko, there's not too much to say. She knocks her out early in the second round, only 26 seconds in. And that was after just a ground assault by Shevchenko. She's had these great trip takedowns. And Jessica Eye really, she threw two punches. She did nothing else on the night. She was basically a punching bag, sparring dummy, whatever you want to say, for Shevchenko. I didn't see anything out of Eye. She threw some kind of over-the-top haymaker-type punches, trying to catch Shevchenko with just her, puncher's chance early on in the first round. That was when she was the most, effective, but that lasted for about all of 10 seconds because Shevchenko had this fight everywhere that Eye was trying to take it. And, we called this one pretty correct. I think the world called it correct, though. We don't know anybody that I think can hang with Shevchenko right now. I expect her to be the champion for a long time, and I think that ladies 125-pound division is pretty much locked up. Now we have the people's fight. We have Tony Ferguson defeating Donald Cerrone in a fight that we called correctly. This thing was definitely fight of the night, and it was a very interesting bout. So I think when we saw this thing start up, Cerrone did not have his typical slow start, but we saw Tony have his rhythm catching shots that he just needs to take, it seems. So I thought Cowboy looked really good in the first few minutes, definitely, most of the first round against Tony. He was throwing some good kicks in there. He was catching him with some great, combinations, and he was popping him with a good jab. But Tony just started feeling the rhythm, and he started spinning. He started moving around, and, Tony was pulling off some spectacular, tactical movements. He was popping Cowboy with a jab, spinning around, turns back to him, catching him with elbows. I mean, he was just looking good. I think that Donald even panicked a little and went for a takedown against Tony, which I thought was kind of a bad move, but he was getting beat up on the feet. So, maybe it was just something he had to do to try to survive in there. And, it was kind of how I started playing out ultimately. Cowboy just couldn't break Tony. I think it was a little like the Diaz fight. You could see, Cowboy looked pretty good at first. You realized he was giving Tony his best up, and Tony was just getting started. He had no extra gears to kick into like Tony did, and Tony just started turning the tide. And in that second round, you could see that it was going to be all Tony, even if this fight did make the third round. So, obviously we know that it was a TKO, doctor stoppage. It was kind of Cowboy's fault. He blew out his nose, caused his eye to, swell up, and, that's really what did it in. Would he have done any better in the third round? I think not. I think Tony maybe was dipping his head a bit. Cowboy could have caught him with that great head kick via, a la Matt Brown, the way he put him out. But that's not the way it played out. I think that was the only way Cowboy was going to win this one. It just didn't go that way. And another thing, too, I know Tony was feeling a little bit bad about hitting Cowboy after the bell. He was going through his motions to throw in a combination, and he knows he screwed up. He didn't want to win that way, but hey, he got a victory, and I'm going to call it here now. I hope it's on Khabib. That's really what I think the world wants to see. I hope that we get Ferg taking on Khabib sometime this year, or, God forbid something happens to Poirier, but we know a guy that can step in. Hats off to Tony, and we made a good call. Moving on to our next fight, we had Petr Yan defeating Jimmy Rivera in kind of an interesting fashion. So we saw Jimmy Rivera actually outstrike Petr Yan, even though, he ended up losing. And I think that was because Petr Yan was just hitting him with better shots, cleaner shots. I think he got 2 knockdowns on the night, and he also scored that takedown. And he really just did more. He was more efficient, ultimately, than Rivera. But, this Rivera style, I'm just not a fan of. He tries to go in like, he's a big, tough guy, and I'm going to put him down. And, I don't expect anything more from, that Tiger Schulman camp where they're smacking their fighters in the face, trying to amp them up. Like, look, you're going into a cage fight. You don't need to take any extra damage. You don't need to be smacked in the face by your coach to know, you're going into war. And I don't know. I didn't like that. It wasn't a good look for the sport. I think we've moved past this tough man days of guys going in there and getting knocked around and just trying to come out the, tougher piece of iron at the end of the day. Anyways, Petr Yan, though, great boxing. He had great movement. He did catch a couple from Rivera, but at no point was he really wobbled or hurt. And I think that Yan looked really good overall on the night. He had great combinations. He was just really good. The only thing I can say about Rivera, though, great takedown defense. He was very difficult guy to take down. He's got great defense, and that's always proved pretty well for him. But this whole tough man attitude is not going to work for him anymore. I think he's got a bit of a button with those 2 knockdowns, and I am looking forward to seeing Petr Yan fight again. We got one hell of an amazing bantamweight division out there, and Yan's just one of the many contenders that I can see coming after Cejudo. Either way, though, we called this one right, so I was happy to make that call. In our next heavyweight bout, we had kind of a clash of the titans here with Blagoy Ivanov defeating Tai Tuivasa. Not really too much to say about this fight. I mean, these guys were exchanging blows. I thought that Blagoy, as I said, had better boxing, was more technical. We saw that against Junior Dos Santos, and that's kind of how it played out. Tai Tuivasa did wobble Blagoy once, but Blagoy knocked him down, so it was kind of even in that regard, and this fight mostly stayed on the feet. Both men very tired at the end of this thing. I'm not really sure how any of them were left standing when the final bell rang. But ultimately, Blagoy just nailed more punches. I think he did a little more damage. And those takedowns. He got those 2 takedowns on the night, which I think really helps supplant his victory there. So no shoeys out in Chicago with Tai Tuivasa taking an L. But hey, that's how it goes. And we did call this one right. So again, happy to call it. In another great matchup, this time at ladies strawweight, we had Tatiana Suarez defeating Nina Ansaroff. And this was kind of how I started playing out. Suarez nailing a lot of takedowns, grinding this fight down. However, we saw a little chink in the armor of Suarez. So once Nina was on her feet, she threw some really good strikes in there. On her feet, I think she started hurting Suarez towards the end of the third round. This was a 5-round fight. I would have been, hard-pressed to say that Suarez was going to walk away with it. We could see that she had, I think done something to Suarez that never really happened before. She hurt her, by catching her with some good, clean shots. Suarez is kind of a dominating fighter so far. She's still a little green. I think this was her 8th or 9th fight. and she just hasn't had that experience getting clipped yet. So it will be interesting to see how she goes from here, Suarez. But maybe it was just good experience. Good to get hit with some hard shots just to learn that you can't just dominate all these things. You are going to have some dogfights. And I got to hats off to Nina here, because she did, show how tough she was. She was getting dominated for 2 straight rounds, came back in the third. She had that lioness, Amanda Nunes type determination, and she was able to, harness, and she went in and dug in for a third round and turned this into trench warfare. She went out there and just started laying shots down on Suarez and preventing takedowns and making it a fight that she thought maybe she could have won at the end. I mean, she had some great wheel kicks out there. She connects with one of those, and maybe it's lights out Suarez and we get this one wrong. But ultimately, we did not get it wrong. Suarez was too dominating in the first 2 rounds, and we did call this one correctly. In our next bout, we had another bantamweight matchup with Aljamain Sterling taking on Pedro Munoz. And so we got this one wrong. This starts kind of a chain of events where we get quite a few fights wrong of the night here. But Aljamain Sterling looked amazing. His range, his kicks kept Pedro Munoz off him. This is a very interesting matchup just from a frame perspective. Munoz had a really hard time getting inside on Sterling. He did it on a couple of occasions, but he was outstruck 105 to 174 in a fight that just stayed on the feet. There was no takedowns. It's going to be really hard if you cannot close that distance. I mean, talking about the main event again, we saw Cejudo, right? Cejudo in the first round couldn't close the distance, and he was kicked and pushed off the entire time. If you do not take a chance to get inside on a rangy fighter, he is going to pick you apart, and I think that's basically what happened with Aljo on Munoz. Some points they did get into a little bit of a brawl where they stepped into the pocket, but Munoz wasn't able to do much with that, and Sterling, I think maybe even got the better of a couple of those exchanges. I did like Munoz coming into this fight after his fight with Garbrandt, but that's just not the way it played out. Garbrandt doesn't have that big frame like Sterling, and he wasn't able to exploit any kind of inside the pocket exchanges like he did with Garbrandt. So ultimately, we did get this one wrong. Aljamain Sterling got the W, and I think he's now setting his sights on that 135-pound bantamweight belt. In another fight that we were not able to call correctly, we had Alexa Grasso defeating Karolina Kowalkiewicz in what was a pretty, kind of frustrating fight for me. So Kowalkiewicz was making a lot of mistakes. She was not being efficient. She was just eating a lot of shots and trying to prove that she was the tougher fighter in there. And Grasso was hitting her with great combinations, 3, 4, 5-punch combinations that ended in kicks a lot of times. That Karolina just could not hang with. And even though I said that Grasso was not going to be as technical a fighter, Karolina, proved that she was the way less technical fighter. She was way less efficient. She was outstruck pretty handily, 148 to 90. It just wasn't a good look. She didn't press any kind of ground game either. She did grind on the cage a little bit to try to press her a takedown, but Kowalkiewicz was not able to succeed in that regard. And we saw that, Grasso was just the much better fighter overall. It's just the way it played out. I'm a little disappointed by it, my own call here. I'll maybe talk a little bit about changes in the future because of a couple fights like this. We'll get to that a little later. But either way, we did get this one wrong. And, hey, it's just the way it plays out sometimes. In our next bout, one that we did call correctly, Calvin Kattar defeated Ricardo Lamas. And not really too much to say here. Kattar just looked like the much better fighter. I think, Lamas was throwing some decent kicks, but ultimately, Kattar could not be stopped. He's just an aggressive fighter. He comes forward. He's got very high-level boxing, and he just looked amazing, knocking out Lamas at 4:06 into the first round. It was an amazing fight for Kattar, and I look forward to calling more of his picks in the future. Either way, though, we got this one right, and I was happy to make that call. In another fight here, we had Yan Jiang taking on Angela Hill in what became a fight where I was so happy Angela Hill didn't perform well because I hate calling for her. She just makes me nervous every time I have to. In this case, though, I was able to pick against her, and Jan ended up picking up the W here. I thought that she was just more aggressive than Hill, especially in that third round. I mean, she was just coming forward. She was walking Hill down, and she was throwing great shots in there, and she just looked amazing at that strawweight division. So I do look forward for more out of this Chinese fighter in Yan, and I was happy to make that call against Hill. Sorry for the hate, she just never performs like her numbers. That's all I could say of Angela Hill. Great output, but no damage inflicted, and that's kind of the tale of her tape. So either way, we called Yan here, and I was damn happy about that. In our next fight, we had a kind of a non-event here. We had Darren Stewart taking on Bevan Lewis in a middleweight matchup that was just very boring. We saw Darren Stewart, and he ended up winning this fight, so we got it wrong. He was not afraid to come in and lay it on the line and throw heavy shots, and Bevin Lewis was just not interested at all in engaging in that kind of contest. He wanted to get a takedown, he wanted to grind down Stewart, and he couldn't. His takedowns were crap. He looked awful. Bevin just, he just didn't really show up. He wouldn't engage in the pocket. He wouldn't throw good shots. He was just kind of, throwing maybe a single jab out there just to, set up for these grinding takedowns on the cage, and there was just nothing in it. I thought ultimately maybe Lewis could have won because he controlled the fight as far as, keeping the exchanges on the fence. But Darren Stewart did such a great job defending takedowns, and he was the more aggressive fighter once they'd break out of the clinch. So I could see why they gave it to Stewart, but Bevin Lewis did outstrike him by one extra blow, so maybe you could argue that he edged it out. Either way, though, it ended up, I think, being like 29-28 or 30-27 for Darren Stewart. It was unanimous. And I was a little disappointed to have called it that way, but hey, it's just the way things play out sometimes. And then that takes us to our last two bouts, both going to be L's for us on the evening. We had Eddie Wineland defeating Grigory Popov, and I was a little sad to see Popov lose. He's a guy making his UFC debut. I think he's coming in, they said his family, he wasn't allowed to have any more children with his wife unless he got that UFC contract. So guy in his, mid-30s fighting his way up to the top, getting the UFC contract, and just getting derailed was a little sad to see. But, Eddie Wineland was a former WEC champion, and, he really proved that. I mean, that guy looked unstoppable tonight. But, his record shows ultimately he does get streaky. He wins, he loses, he wins, he loses. And then we just caught him on a W kind of night, and he just looked way better than Popov. I mean, Popov was using some of his Muay Thai style to keep him at bay and keep the range, but Wineland just walking him down, coming forward, eating shots, and then putting the pain on Popov to a KO punches at 4:47 in the second round. We could see that Popov was relatively tough. He did take a lot of shots. He did not want to go down, but Wineland just made him eat knuckle sandwiches all contest, and ultimately he did pick up the W, so we called this one incorrect. Moving on to our opening fight of the evening, we had Joanne Calderwood losing to Caitlin Chookagian, and I was disappointed in this outcome. So Calderwood outstrikes Chookagian and nails 3 takedowns, but Chookagian does more damage with her 82 strikes to 112, and she ends up picking up the W here. You could see that, basically for every punch that Calderwood threw, Chookagian just did more. It was more efficient with everyone she ended up throwing out there, and she was very ineffective with her takedowns. So Calderwood nailed takedowns, like she was getting her on the ground, but she wouldn't do anything with her. She basically let Chookagian get back to her feet almost immediately, Had she done something with the takedowns, had put in some kind of control, I think we would have got this one correct. Ultimately, though, things just did not go in our favor, and Calderwood ended up picking up the L here, and I think it just ultimately came down to the way this fight played out. Like, better hands, out of Calderwood, just not as much damage, and she nailed all those takedowns, just didn't do anything with them. So it's just a frustrating fight from perspective where, all the numbers played out in Calderwood's, favor, and ultimately, like, the final outcome of just numbers look like they're in her favor, and she just was not able to close the door here. She was not able to get enough done. She wasn't able to smell blood and be the superior fighter that night. So kind of is what it is. I was disappointed to start things off with an L. Ultimately, we did finish 7-6, though. It was a little tough, though, because some of those fights were so heavily favored that, ultimately you weren't making a lot of money on this one, if any at all. So I do apologize for that one. It's just the way things play out. I'll be back, though, always. I finished 7-6. I shouldn't be too down on myself. It just happened to be. So I'm going to come back. I'm going to do better. That's all I'm going to say about that. So before we get into housekeeping, I want to talk about one thing, because I promised you guys I would talk about metric changes, and I am making a metric change. It's kind of a big one, but it's one that I've thought about for a very long time, and it played into 2 contests last night. It played into the Cejudo fight as well as the Cavage fight, and that is something where I try to measure the fighter's style. Now, in my earlier versions of this, I used to use style a little more heavily as a statistic, and it kind of became this almost like appendix from an old version that I was hanging on to, because most of the time it just didn't really matter. Fighters generally ended up with similar numbers here, so I just never really touched it. And last night in those 2 events, it became a factor. It became a big factor. I went back and I back tested, and most of the time it just didn't matter. Actually, none of the time it mattered in all my back testing. And so finally, with it costing me these 2 fights, costing all of us these 2 fights. I decided to pull it out of the metric, and so going forward, we're not going to be doing anything regarding straight up style. We'll see how it plays out, though. We are going to have a layoff next week, so we'll probably be coming back at you with some more whiskey reviews. But June 22nd, that's going to be our next version of our metric, so we'll see how it plays out when we get there. This brings us on to housekeeping, though. So please get in touch with the Fighting Spirit Podcast via email at fightingspiritpodcast@gmail.com for all your questions, comments, concerns. Throw them out there at me. I am also on Spotify, YouTube, iTunes, all those places. Subscribe, like, and give me your feedback on them. That's what I would love to have. Also, I am now on Twitter, so I am posting there. You can follow me at MMAFightPicks01. You can find me there. I basically post the same kind of stuff I post to the Facebook page, so if you're a Facebook follower, please add me there. It'd be a good way to continue to, keep in touch. And Twitter's probably a little easier platform, I think, for some people to engage with an audience, and so that's what I would love to do there. So please follow me there, get in touch with me, ask me any questions. Open book, as always, especially at these early stages where we don't have a whole lot of messages. All right, so as I said earlier, we do have a layoff next week. We will not be back until June 22nd, so we're probably going to sneak in a few whiskey reviews just to get a little content out there, so look out for those. I'll be back crunching the fights, though, as always on Tuesday, so look forward for that. Until then, though, happy fight picking.